A misaddressed letter is usually nothing more than a mistake, something to be corrected, forgotten, thrown away. But in the quiet stretch of the American West, where distance still decides who gets heard and who gets forgotten, one wrong envelope changed everything. A cowboy who had no reason to get involved read a letter that was never meant for him, and instead of ignoring it, he rode 40 miles into uncertainty just to find a woman he had never met. What he discovered wasn't just a missing destination. It was a chain of silence, buried history, and lives quietly shaped by things that were never delivered on time. This is a Western storytelling channel built around cowboy life, love in the American frontier, motherhood, and the quiet kind of human compassion that still survives in forgotten places where people don't always say what they feel, but they always show it through action. At its heart, this story is not about a letter. It is about how small moments of attention can interrupt years of emotional distance, and how doing the right thing sometimes means walking into someone else's unfinished story. It reminds us that kindness is rarely convenient, but it is always necessary. If stories like this speak to you, don't forget to like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more Western tales that carry love, pain, and humanity across the open land.
The sky over the Western Plains had a way of pretending nothing had ever gone wrong in the world. That morning it was clear in a way that felt almost suspicious. No storm hanging on the horizon, no wind pushing dust into restless shapes, just a wide, open blue stretched over land that had seen too many seasons to trust calm weather for long. The kind of quiet that didn't soothe people so much as make them notice what they had been avoiding thinking about. Somewhere out there, 40 miles of dirt road cut across ranch country like an old decision that had never been properly explained. She had been driving since before sunrise. The woman kept both hands on the wheel, though the road was straight enough that she could have relaxed if she wanted to. She didn't. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, like something that refused to belong to the present moment. It was worn at the edges, sealed again after being opened by someone else long ago, then returned, then forwarded, then delayed by systems that did not feel responsible for time. Her name was on it. At least a version of it was. The spelling was correct enough to be legally recognizable, but not correct enough to have ever reached her when it mattered. 10 years had passed since it was first mailed. 10 years was long enough for a person to stop expecting anything to arrive for them at all. She had told herself she came here for closure. That was the word that made it sound reasonable. Closure sounded organized, almost administrative, like something you could file away and never revisit again. But the truth sitting under that word was less neat. She had come because she could no longer tolerate, not knowing why, something that carried her name had been allowed to disappear without anyone ever asking whether she might want it back. In the official version of her life, the one written in forms and records and signatures, she was someone who responded late to things. Someone who missed deadlines. Someone who should have followed up sooner. That version never accounted for the years when she had not even known there was something to respond to. That was the part no document ever admitted. Absence of information did not appear as harm in any system she had ever dealt with. It simply looked like inaction. What she did not say out loud, even to herself, most days was that this letter had nothing to do with curiosity. It had to do with the quiet humiliation of realizing that parts of your life can be decided without you, simply because no one reached you in time. 40 miles ahead, the ranch waited. He was already there when the sun rose, though there had started to feel less like a place and more like a temporary assignment that refused to end. The man had never intended to stay on this land longer than necessary. He was not the owner, not the heir, not even the kind of caretaker who built attachment into his work. He was the kind of man people trusted with unfinished things papers that needed sorting, structures that needed basic upkeep, silence that needed to be maintained until someone more official arrived to replace him. The ranch office smelled like old paper and dust warmed by sunlight. He had been going through a storage box of mail that had never been delivered properly, letters and notices and legal envelopes that belonged to people who were no longer here to claim them. Most of them were routine tax notices, insurance updates, things that lost importance the longer they were ignored. The envelope that changed everything did not look different at first. It was ordinary in every way, except for the small error in the address line. A single misplaced letter in the town name, subtle enough that a machine might have accepted it, but a delivery route would not. It had been sitting in the box long enough to collect a thin layer of dust along its fold lines, as if even time had been unsure what to do with it. He almost set it aside. Almost. What stopped him was not duty. It was something smaller, harder to name. A habit, maybe, formed from years of working around people. Leftovers learning that sometimes the most important things are the ones that look like they have already been decided for you. He opened it without thinking it would matter. That was the part he would later struggle to explain to himself. Inside, there was a letter addressed to a woman he did not know. At least, he did not know her in the way the world officially recognizes knowing someone. But the name stayed with him in a way that made the air in the room feel slightly different after he read it. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden revelation, no thunderclap of understanding. Just a slow awareness that what he was holding had been separated from the person it belonged to for far too long. The letter was not long. It did not need to be. It referenced land rights, a small inheritance tied to a portion of the ranch property, a notice of decision that should have required her presence, her signature, her awareness. It also contained something else, something less formal and more human, written in the margins by someone who was no longer alive to correct it. A brief apology and a question that did not belong in any legal document. He read that line twice. Then again. It was not the content that unsettled him. It was the implication that someone had tried to reach her and failed. Not because she was unwilling, but because the system had simply not delivered her existence into the right place at the right time. He looked out the office window. The ranch stretched beyond it, quiet and unchanged, as if it had nothing to do with human decisions at all. 40 miles of road separated this place from the nearest town, where she might still be living her life unaware that something had been waiting for her here all this time. He did not think of it as a decision at first. It felt more like a correction. People liked to believe that justice, when it happened, arrived through institutions. Paperwork, notifications, proper channels. But standing there with the letter in his hand, he understood something simpler. If no system had managed to deliver this truth, then it had not arrived at all. And if it had not arrived, it was still out there, unfinished. He folded the letter carefully, as if it might break if handled too roughly. By the time he stepped outside, the air had warmed slightly, the sun higher now, turning the land into something that looked more permanent than it really was. He checked the tack on his horse out of habit rather than necessity. The animal shifted under him, sensing the difference in his intent, even if it did not understand it. 40 miles was not a long ride in ranch terms. It was not even unusual. But this was not a ride for work or supply or routine travel. It was something else, something that did not yet have a proper name in his mind. Before he left, he paused at the edge of the yard. There was no one to tell, no one to ask permission. The ranch, in its current legal state, belonged to paperwork more than it belonged to people. And paperwork, he had learned, rarely objected to anything as long as it was eventually explained. He rode out without knowing what he would say when he found her. Only that he would. The morning after the letter was opened did not feel different in any obvious way, but the ranch had a habit of changing without announcing itself. The wind moved through the fence lines with the same rhythm as always. The horses shifted in the same slow patterns of routine, and the distant road still cut across the land like something unfinished. Yet something in the caretaker's attention had shifted, as if a small object inside the mind had been turned and was now reflecting light in a direction it never had before. He had not told anyone about the letter. There was no one to tell in the immediate sense, and even if there had been, he was not sure how to explain what it meant without making it sound larger or smaller than it actually was. On paper, it was a misdirected piece of mail, a correction waiting to be made, a task that could be handed off to someone else with more authority and less hesitation. But the problem was that once he had read it, it no longer felt like paper. It felt like something that had been delayed inside the world itself. The woman whose name was on it did not belong to his life. That was the simple truth. And yet, the letter had created a connection that no legal boundary could easily undo. Not because of sentiment, not because of romance, but because of responsibility. Someone had been waiting for something they were never told existed. That kind of absence was not neutral. It shaped a person without asking permission. He had decided to ride 40 miles to find her. Not because he knew what would happen when he arrived, and not because he believed the meeting would resolve anything cleanly, but because leaving the situation untouched now felt like participating in the same silence that had already lasted 10 years. The ranch, however, did not care about his internal reasoning. It continued to require maintenance, attention, and presence. So before he left, he finished what needed finishing, checked what needed checking, and left instructions that no one would likely need to follow. Only then did he mount his horse and turn toward the road. 40 miles in this country was not measured in distance alone. It was measured in changes of terrain, in the gradual thinning of certainty, in the way human structures became less frequent until only land and weather remained. The road was not a straight line so much as a habit worn into the ground by repetition. He followed it, the way people follow thoughts they cannot yet put into words. He did not think of himself as important in this story. That was part of what made the decision feel stable rather than dramatic. He was simply the person who had read what others had failed to deliver. A carrier of consequences, not a creator of them. While he rode, the woman was still in motion as well. Stopped once at a gas station, miles back, not because she needed fuel immediately, but because the act of stopping gave her a chance to look at the envelope again without the responsibility of moving forward at the same time. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, but in implication. It was the kind of object that did not reveal its importance immediately, as if it was waiting for a specific internal readiness that could not be rushed. She had opened it once, years ago, or at least she believed she had. The memory of that moment was no longer precise. What she remembered instead was the absence that followed it. No response, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that anything had changed because of it. Eventually, she stopped asking questions because asking without answers began to feel like a habit of self-injury. What she did not know, what she had never been told, was that the address had been wrong in a way that was almost invisible to systems built on efficiency rather than understanding. A single deviation in spelling had redirected the letter into a storage chain, where it remained until someone decided that old mail deserved to be sorted, not discarded. She arrived at the ranch boundary just before midday. The sign marking the property was simple, weathered wood with lettering that had faded unevenly under years of sun. Beyond it, the land opened into a wide stretch of controlled wilderness. Fences, grazing fields, and the distant outline of buildings that looked less like ownership and more like stewardship. She parked her car at the edge of the dirt road and sat for a moment without moving. It was not fear that held her still. It was something closer to hesitation shaped by time. 10 years had a way of making any destination feel slightly unreal when finally reached. She had imagined this place in fragments over the years, but imagination always leaves out details that reality insists on including. The envelope was in her hand when she stepped out of the vehicle. She did not yet know that someone had already read it. Inside the ranch office, the caretaker was going through one last check of supplies when he saw her approaching. At first, she was just a figure in the distance, aligned with the road in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. He did not move immediately. Something about the sight of her arriving made the earlier decision feel suddenly real in a way it had not during the ride. She walked with the careful pace of someone entering a place that had never once been asked to wait for her. When they finally came within speaking distance, neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the presence of something neither of them had chosen, but both were now required to acknowledge. He held the letter in his hand. She noticed it immediately. That was the moment the structure of the situation shifted, though neither of them could have named how. "I think this belongs to you," he said at last. His voice was steady, but not rehearsed. There was no practiced delivery in it, no attempt to control how the moment would be received. Only the simple act of transferring responsibility from one person to another. She took the letter slowly, as if the paper itself might resist. For a moment, she did not open it. She simply looked at it, recognizing her own name in a way that felt both familiar and distant, like seeing handwriting you once believed you understood, but no longer fully trusted. "You read it," she said, not as accusation, but as confirmation of something she already understood. "I did," he replied. There was no apology in his answer. Not because he lacked awareness, but because apology did not seem like the correct category for what had happened. It had not been an intrusion. It had been an interception of something that had already gone wrong long before him. She finally opened it again. This time, there was no delay in delivery. No system standing between her and the words. Only paper, ink, and time collapsing into the present. As she read, her expression did not change quickly. There was no sudden emotional break, no visible collapse of composure. Instead, what shifted was something quieter. A recognition forming in stages, like someone slowly realizing that a missing piece of their life had not been lost, but withheld. The letter spoke of land, of legal standing, of rights that should have been communicated years ago. But it also carried something less formal, a handwritten addition from someone who had once intended to make sure she was not forgotten by the decisions being made around her life. A question remained at the bottom of the page. Not directed to the court, not directed to the ranch, directed to her. She did not speak for a long time after reading it. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. 10 years, she said, not as complaint, but as fact that had finally been confirmed. He nodded slightly. It didn't reach you. It was not an excuse, it was a description. She looked out toward the land beyond the ranch buildings. 40 miles had brought her here, but it no longer felt like distance was the meaningful part of the journey. What mattered was what had been interrupted along the way. Someone decided, I didn't need to see this, she said. He did not correct her, because in a sense, she was right. Even if no single person had made that decision, the outcome remained the same. No, he said finally. Something failed to carry it forward. The words hung between them without resolution. Behind them, the ranch continued its quiet existence, unaware of the shift that had just occurred in how its history was being understood. And somewhere in that silence, the simple fact remained. A letter addressed wrong had finally arrived, but only after it had already changed everything it was meant to explain. The land changed the way it revealed itself when people stopped talking and started working. It did not become louder or more dramatic. It simply made its details unavoidable. The fence lines that once looked straight from a distance began to show their age when inspected closely, leaning slightly in places where the ground had shifted over the years. The dust between the structures carried small variations in color that only became noticeable when someone was forced to slow down long enough to see them. Even the silence had layers here, wind passing through dry grass, wood creaking under temperature shifts, distant animals moving in patterns shaped by habit rather than urgency. By the third day, after the letter had been delivered, the ranch was no longer just a place where two strangers stood with a shared document between them. It had become a working arrangement, even if neither of them had formally agreed to call it that. There were tasks that could not be postponed, records that needed to be reconciled, boundaries that required clarification. The legal language of the situation remained present in theory, but in practice, the land demanded physical attention first and interpretation second. The cowboy moved through it with the familiarity of someone who had learned the rhythm of maintenance over time rather than inheritance. He checked water lines in the morning when the ground still held a trace of coolness from the night. He walked the fence edges in a slow loop that allowed him to notice where the tension had loosened or where posts had begun to tilt under pressure that no longer looked dramatic, but had accumulated quietly over seasons. His attention was not mechanical, but it was disciplined. There was a difference between caring for something and belonging to it. And he had always existed in the space between those two states. The woman, by contrast, moved through the same space with a different kind of attention. She did not see the ranch as a living system in the same instinctive way. She saw structure, documentation, gaps between what was recorded and what was physically present. She carried a small notebook where she wrote down inconsistencies, not because she distrusted the land, but because she had learned over time that systems fail most often where they assume continuity. The first task they were forced to share was the inventory, not a symbolic one, a literal accounting of property, assets, and land use records tied to the estate. Boxes of old documents had been stored in the ranch office, some labeled properly, others marked with handwriting that suggested urgency rather than organization. The process required them to sit at the same table for long periods without the protection of distance or movement. At first, they divided the work without discussion. She took the documents with official markings, leases, and legal notices. He handled older field records, maintenance logs, and handwritten notes from previous caretakers. It was an unspoken agreement that mirrored their internal assumptions. She dealt with structure. He dealt with survival. But the separation did not hold. There were moments when a single document required both perspectives. A boundary line drawn on paper that did not match the physical fence outside. A recorded acreage that no longer reflected how the land was actually used. A signature that appeared valid until compared against an earlier version of the same authorization. Each inconsistency created a small pause in the rhythm of sorting, forcing them into brief exchanges that were not yet conversations, but were no longer silence. The cowboy noticed things that were not written. The way certain sections of land had been avoided in older notes without explanation. The subtle repetition of phrases that suggested someone had been trying to justify decisions rather than simply record them. He did not always know how to articulate what he saw, but he trusted it in a way that came from living close to work that could not be fully captured on paper. The woman noticed something else. Patterns of omission. Entire periods where documentation became sparse, then resumed as if nothing had happened in between. She had seen that pattern before, in other contexts, places where accountability faded, not because events stopped occurring, but because no one was assigned to record them. By the end of the first day of inventory, neither of them had reached a conclusion, but both had begun to understand something uncomfortable. The ranch they were dealing with existed in two versions, one recorded in documents and one lived in practice. The gap between those versions was not accidental. It was simply unattended. The second task was repair. A section of fencing near the northern pasture had collapsed during a recent wind shift, leaving a gap that needed to be fixed before the cattle moved through the area. It was not a complicated job in technical terms, but it required coordination. Posts had to be reset, wire tension restored, alignment corrected along a line that stretched farther than either of them could hold in view at once. They worked without formal instruction. He handled the physical structure, moving along the line, lifting and securing where needed. She assisted by measuring spacing, marking points where alignment had drifted, and holding sections steady when tension needed to be restored. At first, the coordination was awkward, shaped by uncertainty about how much to speak and how much to simply observe. But the land did not wait for communication to become perfect. At one point, the wire resisted more than expected, snapping back slightly when released. He adjusted without comment, and she stepped forward instinctively to stabilize the next section before it could repeat the same movement. It was not planned. It was not discussed. It simply happened in the space where attention overlapped. Neither of them acknowledged it immediately. That was not avoidance. It was recognition that some forms of understanding do not require verbal confirmation to exist. The third task was waiting. A legal confirmation from a county office was expected to arrive or be verified within a certain time frame tied to the estate process. Until then, they were required to remain on site. There was no productive work to complete during this period. Only presence. It was during this waiting that the ranch began to feel different. Without tasks to structure their interaction, time became more visible. The sound of footsteps across wooden flooring became noticeable in a way it had not before. The distance between rooms felt longer. Even the shared silence in the office carried weight, as if it were now something actively maintained, rather than simply occurring. The child appeared more frequently during this phase, not as interruption, but as continuity. The child did not belong to either of them, at least not in any formal sense. They were part of the broader landscape of the ranch, someone who had been present before the letter, before the paperwork, before the arrival of outside authority. The child moved through spaces with the ease of someone who had never needed permission to belong to them. It was the child who first commented on the way they worked together, not as observation, but as simple statement. "You don't bump into each other anymore," the child said one afternoon, as if noting a change in weather. Neither adult responded immediately, not because the comment was uncomfortable, but because it was accurate in a way that neither of them had chosen to analyze. That night, the woman reviewed the documents again alone, not because she distrusted what had been found, but because she was trying to understand how something so significant could have remained hidden within systems designed specifically to prevent that kind of absence. The cowboy sat outside for a long time, looking toward the line of the horizon where the land flattened into distance that no longer felt purely physical. Neither of them spoke about the letter that evening, but both of them understood something that had not been clear at the beginning of the week. This was no longer about delivery error. It was about everything that happens after a system decides, quietly and without acknowledgement, that some people can wait without consequence. And the ranch, in its quiet persistence, was no longer just a place where land was being measured. It was becoming a place where that assumption was finally being questioned. The man who had once sorted mail for the county did not live far from the ranch, but distance was not the reason people rarely visited him. It was more the sense that he existed slightly outside the present tense of the town, like someone who had stepped back from the main current of things and chosen not to return. His house sat near the edge of a gravel road where the land to lose its structure and become open again, as if it had decided to stop organizing itself for human convenience. When the cowboy left the ranch that morning, he did not announce it. There was no need. The legal process tied to the estate allowed for movement within a certain informal flexibility, as long as the work remained uninterrupted. The woman stayed behind at the ranch office, reviewing documents again with the quiet persistence of someone who had learned that clarity does not arrive all at once. The child moved between rooms without asking questions, as if aware that questions were not always the most useful form of attention. The ride to the former postal worker, Sass home, was shorter than the 40 miles that had brought everything into motion, but it felt structurally similar. The road did not change dramatically, yet the sense of transition was clear. Each mile seemed to remove another layer of assumption about how information was supposed to travel between people. Mail, in theory, was simple. Something was written, sent, delivered. But the reality of rural systems had always contained more friction than the theory accounted for. Weather, staffing, misreading, misplacement, delay. Small interruptions that accumulated quietly until they became something larger than their parts. The former postal worker was outside when the cowboy arrived, though it was unclear whether he had been waiting or simply existing in a routine that not distinguished sharply between atli, inside, and outside. He was older than the kind of age that invites explanation. His movements were unhurried, not because of weakness, but because urgency no longer seemed to be part of his relationship. With time, he recognized the cowboy without surprise. "That letter," the man said before any greeting had been exchanged, as if the subject had already been introduced somewhere earlier in time. The cowboy dismounted but did not immediately respond. He had brought the letter with him, folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, not because he expected confrontation, but because he had learned that objects like that tend to matter more when they are physically present during conversations about them. "You've seen it?" the cowboy asked. The man nodded slowly. "Not that one specifically at first, but I know the kind of mistake it came from." They stood for a moment without moving toward the house. The air between them was not tense, but it was weighted with the kind of understanding that does not require agreement. Inside, the house was modest, filled with objects that suggested long familiarity, rather than recent arrangement. Papers were still present, though no longer organized with professional precision. A desk near the window held stacks of envelopes that looked like they had been reviewed and then reconsidered many times over. The man gestured toward chairs without ceremony. "You didn't come here for coffee," he said. "No," the cowboy replied. "I came because I need to understand what happened." The former postal worker sat down slowly, as if the question itself required him to adjust his position in time. For a moment, he did not speak. When he finally did, his voice was not defensive. It was careful, shaped by years of explaining things that people often wished were simpler than they were. "People think a mail is about movement," he said, "from one place to another. But out here, it was always more about recognition. You had to recognize where something belonged before you could send it anywhere. And sometimes that recognition depended on things that weren't written down clearly enough." The cowboy listened without interruption. "The address on that letter," the man continued, "was wrong in a way that wouldn't matter in a city. A system would correct it automatically. But here, small differences mean everything. One letter in a town name can send something to a different route entirely. And once it's in the wrong chain, it does to just get lost. It gets filed into waiting." "Waiting for what?" the cowboy asked. The former postal worker looked at him for a long moment before answering. "For someone to decide it matters enough to find its way back." The words did not sound dramatic when spoken. They sounded like description. That was what made them uncomfortable. The cowboy placed the folded letter on the table between them. "It mattered," he said. The man nodded again, slower this time. "I believe you." Outside, the wind moved through dry grass in steady patterns that had nothing to do with the conversation happening inside the house. Time in places like this did not respond to urgency. It responded to accumulation. "What happens when a letter sits too long?" the cowboy asked. The former postal worker leaned back slightly, looking toward the window rather than the table. "People assume it becomes less important," he said. "But that's not true. It just becomes separated from the moment it was meant to belong to. And once that separation happens, someone has to decide whether to reconnect it." There was a pause after that, long enough that the sound of the house itself became noticeable, the settling of wood, the distant movement of something outside, the quiet mechanical rhythm of a place that had stopped trying to appear active. "You know what in it," the cowboy said finally. "I know what it was supposed to carry," the man corrected. "That not always the same thing as what it becomes." The conversation did not produce answers in the way the cowboy had expected when he left the ranch. There was no single moment of revelation, no clear identification of fault that could be assigned and resolved. Instead, what emerged was something more structural. The understanding that failure in systems like this rarely appears as a single event. It accumulates through small permissions granted to delay, to misplace, to assume that someone else will notice. When he left the house later that afternoon, the former postal worker walked him to the edge of the yard. "Most people don't come looking for lost mail," the man said. The cowboy adjusted his saddle without looking up immediately. "Most people assume it stops mattering once it's lost." The man gave a small nod. "That's the part that stays with you, if you've done this work long enough." They did not shake hands. There was no ceremonial closure to the exchange. The understanding between them did not require it. On the ride back, the cowboy thought less about what had been said and more about what had not needed to be said. The letter was no longer just an object that had traveled incorrectly. It was a record of a decision not to interrupt silence when interruption was necessary. When he returned to the ranch, the light was already shifting toward late afternoon. The woman was outside near the office steps, holding a document in one hand but not reading it. The child was nearby, sitting on a wooden rail, watching something in the distance that did not require interpretation. The cowboy dismounted, but did not immediately speak. The woman looked at him briefly. "Did you find anything?" she asked. He hesitated, not because he lacked information, but because information no longer felt like the most accurate word for what he had brought back. "Yes," he said finally, "but not in the way I expected." The child glanced between them but did not interrupt. Behind them, the ranch continued its ordinary existence, unchanged in appearance, but carrying within it a slightly different understanding of how easily something can be separated from the person it belongs to, and how rarely that separation is questioned unless someone chooses to ride far enough to notice it still exists. The ranch had a way of making time feel less like a line and more like a surface you could stand on, as if days did not move forward so much as spread out and settle into the land. By the time the fifth day arrived, since the letter had been placed on the table between them, none of them referred to it directly anymore. Not because it had become less important, but because its importance had started to shape everything else in quieter ways. It was no longer an object that required attention. It had become a condition they were all living inside. The cowboy rose earlier than usual that morning, though nothing on the ranch required urgency. The horses were already settled, the fences checked from the previous day, and the water lines running steady under the soft pressure of routine. Still, he moved as if there was something unfinished in the air, not in a practical sense, but in a way that made stillness feel incomplete. He stood for a moment at the edge of the porch, looking out across the land where the light was just beginning to shift from gray-blue into something warmer, the kind of light that revealed details without announcing them. Inside the office, the woman was already awake. She had not slept well, though she would not have described it that way if asked. It was not restlessness in the dramatic sense. It was more like her mind had refused to fully disengage from the structure of the problem. The documents she had been reviewing the night before were still spread across the table, but she was not reading them. She was sitting with them, as if proximity alone might eventually produce clarity. The child was the first to speak that morning, as they often were without meaning to disrupt anything. They appeared in the doorway, holding a small piece of paper torn from an old notebook, something they had clearly been writing or drawing on earlier. "You two don't talk about it anymore," the child said. The woman looked up first, not immediately responding. The cowboy followed a moment later, turning slightly toward the sound. "About what?" the woman asked, though she already knew. The child shrugged in a way that suggested the question was less important than the observation. "The letter." There was a pause that did not feel uncomfortable, but it did feel revealing. Not because anything had been hidden, but because the absence of discussion had itself become noticeable. "It doesn't need to be talked about all the time," the cowboy said finally. The child nodded as if accepting this, but not necessarily agreeing with it. "It still exists even when you don't talk about it," they said, and then walked away, as if the statement had completed its purpose. Neither adult responded immediately. The words stayed in the room longer than the child did. Later that morning, they returned to work without discussing the exchange. The ranch did not offer many alternatives for how to spend time. There were still records to reconcile, not because anyone was expecting resolution, but because the legal framework surrounding the estate required completion of certain formal steps before anything else could be concluded. Paperwork, in that sense, was not about truth. It was about closure that could be filed. They worked at the same table again, though the arrangement had shifted subtly over the previous days. There was less division between her documents and his documents. Instead, there was a shared pile that neither of them fully claimed, sorted by relevance rather than ownership. At times, their hands reached for the same paper at nearly the same moment, and each time one of them adjusted without comment, allowing the other to continue. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had become structured, shaped by familiarity rather than avoidance. There was a difference between not speaking and not needing to speak, and they were moving slowly, without acknowledgement, from one to the other. By midday, the heat had begun to settle into the land in a way that softened edges without making anything easier. The cowboy stepped outside to check the north fence line again, not because it required immediate attention, but because repetition had become a way of thinking. The physical movement helped organize thoughts that did not yet have language. The woman remained inside for a while longer, reading through a series of older maintenance logs that referenced changes to the ranch going back several years. In one of the entries, she noticed a repeated pattern of delayed notification repairs. Recorded long after they had been completed, inspections logged without corresponding follow-up, and references to mail deliveries that had been marked returned without explanation. The pattern was subtle enough that it would have been easy to ignore if she were not already looking for it. When the cowboy returned, she pointed it out without preface. "This isn't tea, just about one letter," she said. He looked at the papers, then at her. "I know. It was not a disagreement. It was confirmation." The child returned sometime after lunch, carrying a small container of water and sitting near the doorway as if deciding whether to stay or leave again. They watched the adults work for a while without comment, then spoke in the same tone they used for everything that mattered, without announcing itself. "There are a lot of things that didn't get where they were supposed to go," the child said. The woman glanced toward them. "What do you mean?" The child thought for a moment, searching not for words, but for accuracy. Things people were supposed to know, but they didn't. The cowboy stopped what he was doing briefly, though he did not turn fully around. "Like what?" he asked. The child looked at him directly, like people waiting for answers and nobody telling them they were supposed to be waiting. The statement did not come with emotion. It was not an accusation. It was observation, delivered without interpretation. That made it harder to dismiss. The woman closed the folder she had been reading. "That's not just here," she said quietly. The cowboy nodded once. No, he said, it's not. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It formed slowly, like weather changing without announcement. The letter they had been focused on was no longer an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of information that had failed to reach the people it belonged to. Not because anyone had actively prevented it, but because no one had been responsible for ensuring that absence itself was accounted for. That evening, as the light began to soften again across the ranch, they sat outside without working. It was the first time since the letter had been delivered that neither of them had a task requiring immediate attention. The silence this time was different. It was not filled with documents or decisions. It was filled with awareness. The cowboy eventually spoke, not as conclusion, but as continuation of something that had already begun. I didn't ride 40 miles because I thought I'd fix anything, he said. The woman did not look at him immediately. Why did you ride? She asked. He considered the question carefully, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer was not simple enough to be delivered quickly. Because I thought, if I didn't, he said, then it would mean it was okay for things like that to just disappear. She nodded slightly, as if that made more sense than anything else had so far. The child, sitting a short distance away, listened without interrupting. After a moment, they stood and walked back toward the house, leaving the adults in a space that had become quieter without becoming smaller. The sun lowered further, stretching shadows across the yard. The ranch looked the same as it had every day before, but the way it was being seen had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the silence between them no longer felt like absence. It felt like something they were all beginning to understand together, even if none of them had yet said it out loud, that what had been lost in transit was not just a letter, but the assumption that being unreachable was the same as being unimportant. The sixth morning arrived with a kind of stillness that did not feel natural so much as assembled, as if the ranch had been carefully arranged overnight into a quieter version of itself. The wind moved across the open land in long, low patterns that barely disturbed the grass, and even the usual sounds of the property, the shifting of gates, the distant movement of animals, the creak of old wood settling under its own weight, seemed reduced, as though everything was waiting for something to be named before it continued behaving normally again. Inside the ranch office, the table had slowly transformed over the past days into something closer to a record of shared investigation than a workspace. Papers were no longer stacked by category or ownership. They were arranged in overlapping layers of relevance, some marked with notes in handwriting that no longer belonged clearly to either of them. The letter still sat in the center, though it was no longer treated as the beginning or the end of anything. It had become a reference point, a fixed object around which everything else was being measured. The woman had arrived early to the table that morning, earlier than necessary, not because she expected new information, but because she had begun to understand that the ranch did not reveal its structure through urgency. It revealed itself through repetition. She was learning the difference between searching for answers and staying close enough for answers to eventually surface on their own terms. The cowboy joined her a short while later, carrying a small box that had been stored in a back room of the office. He set it down without explanation, though she noticed immediately that it was heavier than it looked. The wood was worn along the edges, not from age alone, but from being handled repeatedly over time. opened and closed more often than its exterior suggested. It was with the older records, he said simply. She did not ask how long it had been there. That question no longer seemed useful. Instead, she'd opened it. Inside were documents that did not belong neatly to any single category. There were land surveys from different decades, some official and stamped, others hand-drawn, with corrections written in margins. There were correspondence copies between previous owners and county offices, some of them incomplete, some duplicated, as if multiple attempts had been made to ensure communication that never fully stabilized. And beneath all of it, there were photographs. The photographs were not arranged with intention. They had simply accumulated. Black and white images of the ranch in earlier stages of its existence, when the fencing was newer, and the structures still bore the confidence of recent construction. In some of them, the land looked almost unfamiliar, less shaped by maintenance and more by possibility. In others, there were people standing near the buildings whose names were not recorded anywhere in the current documents. The woman held one of the photographs longer than the others. It showed a section of land that had since been redivided in official records. In the background, near the edge of the frame, there was a faint structure that no longer existed on the property. It had been removed at some point, though there was no formal record of its removal. "This isn't just history," she said quietly. The cowboy nodded. "It is what was left behind when things changed." They continued going through the contents without rushing. Each document added something, but not in the way of resolution. Instead, each piece expanded the sense that the ranch had been part of a longer chain of decisions than any current record acknowledged. There were gaps between recorded events, periods where information appeared to have been passed informally rather than documented, and notes that referenced conversations rather than official agreements. At one point, the woman found a handwritten page folded into a larger file. The handwriting was different from the others, older, slightly uneven in places where the ink had faded unevenly over time. It was not addressed to any official body. It was not formatted like a record. It was written like someone trying to leave a thought behind in case no one else thought to ask the question later. She read it once without speaking, then again. The cowboy noticed the change in her stillness before she spoke. "What is it?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she handed it to him. The page contained a short message from the previous owner of the ranch. It did not explain transacts or legal arrangements. It did not justify decisions. It simply described a question, one that had been left unresolved intentionally, or perhaps out of exhaustion. The question was not about ownership in the legal sense. It was about whether land like this could ever truly belong to anyone who treated it only as property, rather than as something that held memory. The message ended without conclusion. The cowboy read it slowly, then placed it back on the table. "They weren't trying to close things," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "They were trying to leave something open." That distinction changed the way the room felt, though nothing physically had shifted. The documents were still just paper. The box was still just wood. But the idea that had begun to form around them was no longer purely legal. It had become interpretive in a way that required attention beyond structure. The child arrived sometime later, without announcement, as they often did. They did not ask what the adults were doing. Instead, they moved to the edge of the table and looked at the photographs, without touching them at first. Their presence did not interrupt the work, but it altered its tone slightly, as if the room had adjusted to include a third kind of attention. "That one used to be there," the child said. pointing to the structure visible in one of the older images. The woman looked at them. "You've seen it before?" The child nodded. "Not like that, but I know where it stood." The cowboy glanced at the child. "From who?" The child paused, as if considering whether the answer mattered in the way adults usually wanted answers to matter. "From the land," they said simply. Neither adult responded immediately, not because they doubted the answer, but because it did not fit easily into the categories they had been using to interpret information. The child did not explain further. They did not need to. As the day progressed, they began to assemble what they now understood was not a single narrative, but a layered record of what had been removed, altered, or left undocumented. The letter, which had once seemed like the central object of the situation, now appeared as one entry among many instances where communication had failed to reach its intended recipient. It was not unique in its failure. It was simply the one that had finally been noticed. The cowboy spoke at one point without looking up from the documents. "If this is what happened here," he said, "then it didn't start here." The woman understood what he meant. The patterns they were seeing suggested a broader system of delay and omission, one that extended beyond the ranch and into the way rural communication and land records had been historically managed. It was not a single point of failure. It was a structure that allowed failure to remain unexamined as long as no one specifically asked about what was missing. The child, sitting nearby, listened without contributing, but their presence remained steady, as if anchoring the room to something simpler than analysis. By late afternoon, the light had shifted again, stretching across the ranch in long, low angles that made everything appear slightly older than it had in the morning. The woman finally closed the box, not because they had finished, but because continuing had stopped producing new clarity and had started producing only accumulation. "This does explain everything," she said. The cowboy nodded. "No, but it explains enough to know what we're looking at." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was structured, like something that had been earned rather than imposed. The child stood and walked toward the doorway, then paused. "You were not just reading what happened," they said. "You were reading what didn't get told." Then they left the room. Neither adult responded, but the statement remained with them long after the child had gone. It reframed everything they had been doing. The documents were not simply records of past actions. They were evidence of absences that had never been officially acknowledged. As evening approached, the cowboy looked again at the letter, now folded and placed slightly aside from the main stack of documents. It no longer felt like the center of the situation, but it remained the point at which everything had begun to be questioned. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. 40 miles wasn't about reaching her, he said. The woman looked at him. It was about proving she could still be reached. He finished outside. The ranch continued its quiet existence, unchanged in appearance, but no longer understood in the same way. The land had not altered. The documents had not rewritten themselves. But the act of reading them together had changed the relationship between what was known and what had been left unspoken. And in that shift, the letter was no longer just a mistake in delivery. It had become the first time someone chose to notice that absence itself can be a form of distance no map accounts for. The storm did not arrive like a dramatic event. It came in layers, the way weather often does in wide-open country, where nothing blocks its approach and nothing announces its intentions clearly enough to be mistaken for certainty. At first, it was only a change in the air pressure, subtle enough that most people would have dismissed it as fatigue or coincidence. Then came the shift in sound, the distant flattening of wind across the fields, the way birds disappeared from sight without visible panic, and the slight tightening in the rhythm of the land itself, as if everything had begun to prepare without agreeing to explain what it was preparing for. By mid-afternoon, the ranch had entered that in-between state where normal work becomes quietly impossible to continue. The sky was still light in places, but unevenly so, as though different parts of it were being negotiated by forces not visible from the ground. The cowboy was the first to acknowledge it without speaking. He stood at the edge of the yard, looking toward the northern line, where the clouds were gathering in a low, heavy formation that did not yet feel violent, but already felt final in a way that experience made difficult to ignore. Inside the ranch office, the woman noticed the change through the documents before she noticed it through the window. The paper on the table had begun to shift slightly with each subtle pressure change in the air, and the quiet in the room had become less like silence and more like anticipation. The child, who had been moving between rooms earlier in the day, had already gone outside without asking permission, as if instinct mattered more than instruction when weather began to lose its predictability. It was the child who saw the cattle first reacting in the distance, shifting their position in ways that were not random, but coordinated by something older than training or habit. The child did not run back immediately. They simply watched for a moment, as if confirming that what they were seeing matched something they already understood without needing to be taught. When the child finally returned to the house, they did not speak in alarm. They spoke in observation. "S coming closer," they said. The cowboy had already begun moving toward the equipment shed. Not hurriedly, but with the kind of efficiency that comes from understanding that preparation is not a reaction to fear, but a continuation of responsibility. The woman followed shortly after, though her movements were shaped more by assessment than instinct. She was still reading the land in terms of structure, while he was reading it in terms of behavior. Neither of them called it a storm in the beginning. Out here, naming things too early often created false confidence. The first task was securing what could be secured without debate. Gates had to be reinforced, loose materials had to be brought inside, and anything that could become dangerous under strong wind needed to be either anchored or removed. The child moved alongside them without being instructed, not assisting in the physical sense, so much as ensuring that no part of the property was ignored simply because adults were focused elsewhere. The storm arrived fully while they were still working. It did not arrive as a single moment, but as a collapse of distance. The horizon disappeared first, then the sound changed from directional wind to surrounding pressure, and finally the light itself shifted into a gray that made depth difficult to judge. Rain came in, sheets that did not fall so much as move sideways across the land, driven by forces that made individual drops irrelevant. Inside the barn, they regrouped briefly, not for shelter alone, but for coordination. The cowboy checked the structure with quick, practiced attention, listening for sounds in the wood that might indicate failure points. The woman secured the remaining documents. They had been working through earlier, not because paper mattered more than safety, but because some part of her still understood that information left exposed to disorder could disappear in ways that were not always visible afterward. The child stood near the entrance, watching the outside as if trying to map how the storm was reorganizing the familiar world. For a while, there was no conversation, only movement and sound. Then, without warning, The first critical decision presented itself in a way that did not allow delay. A section of fencing near the lower pasture had failed under pressure, not fully collapsed, but compromised enough that livestock movement could no longer be controlled safely. At the same time, one of the older storage structures had begun to shift under wind load, making it unclear whether it would hold through the next sustained wave. The three of them understood, without needing to articulate it, that they could not address everything at once. The cowboy made the first decision. He moved toward the pasture line, not asking for agreement, because the situation did not offer the luxury of consensus. The woman followed toward the structure, understanding that stability in one place might depend on sacrifice in another. The child remained between them, briefly, then chose a direction neither adult had assigned, moving toward a smaller enclosure where younger animals were held. What followed was not chaos, but distributed responsibility under pressure. The wind intensified, and with it came the kind of visibility that made distance unreliable. Objects that were only a short walk away became difficult to reach without losing orientation. The cowboy reached the fence line and began reinforcing what could still be saved, working against movement that did not respond to negotiation. The woman secured the structure by identifying the weakest points and addressing them in order of immediate risk rather than importance. The child guided smaller animals into safer enclosure with a quiet certainty that did not require explanation. At one point, communication became necessary, but not verbal. A section of debris shifted dangerously near the structure where the woman was working. The cowboy saw it at the same time she did, but from a different angle that made the timing slightly offset. He called out, but the wind carried the sound away before it fully formed. Instead, he changed direction and moved through the storm line directly, reaching the point of instability just as she stepped back on her own recognition of the same risk. There was no moment of acknowledgement between them afterward. There was no need for it. The action itself had already confirmed the understanding. The child, meanwhile, had managed to secure the smaller enclosure, though not without difficulty. When the cowboy reached them later, he found them standing quietly inside the shelter, watching the storm through gaps, the structure as if it were something to be studied rather than feared. You stayed where you were supposed to, the cowboy said. The child looked at him briefly. I stayed where it made sense, they replied. There was no correction offered. As the storm reached its peak, time became less structured. Work blurred into maintenance of presence. There were moments when all three of them were visible to each other across different parts of the ranch, each engaged in separate tasks that collectively formed a single effort, keeping the place from being undone by forces that did not distinguish between important and unimportant. At some point, the woman realized that the documents they had been reviewing earlier no longer felt like the center of anything. They were still important in a formal sense, but the storm had shifted priority into something more immediate. What mattered now was not what had been recorded, but what could be preserved in real time. The cowboy, at another moment, noticed that the land itself behaved differently under stress. Not as enemy or obstacle, but as something that revealed its structure more clearly when forced. Weak points became visible. Strengths became obvious. The storm did not destroy understanding it, clarified it. When the intensity finally began to decrease, it did so gradually, as if the system that had built the storm was carefully releasing control rather than abruptly ending it. The wind lost some of its direction, The rain reduced its force, and the horizon slowly began to reappear as something other than absence. They did not immediately return to the house. Instead, they stood in different parts of the ranch, taking inventory, not of damage alone, but of continuity. Some structures had held, some had not. Some would require repair, and some would require reconsideration of how they were used at all. The child was the first to speak after the storm had fully passed. It didn't break everything, they said. The woman looked across the land. No, she replied, but it showed us what was already weak. The cowboy said nothing at first. Then, after a moment, he added, what storms do here? They began walking back toward the house together, not in formation, but in proximity that had been earned rather than arranged. And somewhere in that quiet after the storm, it became clear that what they had been managing was no longer just an estate, or a letter, or a legal obligation. It was the realization that systems fail in ways that weather eventually exposes, and that what survives is not determined only by strength, but by attention by who notices what is starting to give way before it becomes irreversible. The morning after the storm did not feel like a return to normal, because nothing out here ever truly returned to anything it had been before. Instead, it felt like the land had been reintroduced to itself, stripped of certain assumptions, and left with a quieter honesty. The sky was still heavy in places, not with danger, but with exhaustion, as though even the weather had spent its energy and needed time to remember how to behave again. The ranch was intact in ways that mattered, damaged in ways that required work, and changed in ways that could not be repaired, because they were not damage at all. They were exposure. The fence line in the lower pasture leaned slightly, but still held. The storage structure near the east side would need rebuilding, not because it had failed completely, but because it had revealed that it had been held together by time more than by design. The ground itself bore marks of water that had moved with intention rather than randomness, carving temporary paths that would soon fade but would not be forgotten by those who had seen them form. Inside the ranch office, the table where the documents had once been spread so carefully now carried traces of interruption. Papers had been gathered quickly the night before, stacked, and moved to higher shelves, but not in perfect order. The letter, still present among them, had shifted slightly in its placement, no longer centered, but not forgotten. It had become part of a larger system of meaning that no longer required it to stand alone. The woman arrived first that morning. She moved slowly, not because she was tired in the physical sense, but because she was still processing the way urgency had reorganized everything the day before. She stood for a moment at the doorway, observing the room as if expecting it to speak back to her in a different language. It did not. Instead, it offered continuity, which in its own way was more unsettling than disruption. The cowboy arrived shortly after, carrying tools rather than documents. The shift was subtle but important. Yesterday had been about coordination under pressure. Today was about repair under awareness. He did not speak immediately, not because there was nothing to say, but because the act of returning to work after a storm required a different kind of attention than the work itself. The child was already outside. That fact was not unusual, but the way they were outside was different. They were not running between tasks or observing from a distance. They were moving slowly through the affected areas of the ranch, touching things lightly, as if confirming their continued existence. They stopped near the fence line, near the storage structure, near the places where change had been most visible, not to fix anything, but to understand what had shifted. When the adults finally joined them outside, the work began without formal division. Repair after a storm does not require assignment in the same way routine work does. It requires recognition of priority through presence. What each person moved toward first revealed more about understanding than any spoken plan. The cowboy went to the fence line again. The woman moved toward the structure that would require partial rebuilding. The child remained between them, not as obstruction or help, but as continuity. They watched and occasionally adjusted small things that adults overlooked, not out of negligence, but because attention in adults tends to narrow under the weight of responsibility. At one point, while working near the broken section of structure, the woman found something partially embedded in the debris. It was not immediately clear what it had been part of. It was small, worn, and shaped by time more than by design. She held it carefully, not because she understood its significance, but because experience had taught her that objects recovered after disruption often carry meaning that is not immediately visible. The cowboy noticed her pause. "What is it?" he asked. "I am not sure yet," she said. The child approached slowly, looking at the object without touching it. There was no excitement in their expression, only recognition. "That used to hang inside the old office," the child said. The woman looked at them. "How would you know that?" The child considered the question in the way they often did, not as a challenge, but as something requiring accuracy rather than justification. "Because it was there before everything changed," they said simply. The cowboy glanced at the object again. It was not marked in any official documentation they had reviewed. It did not appear in any of the records tied to the estate. Yet the child's certainty was not the kind that invites correction. It was observational, grounded in continuity rather than explanation. They set the object aside without deciding its meaning. That decision itself was becoming familiar. Not everything needed to be resolved immediately in order to be acknowledged. As the morning progressed, the work became less about repair and more about reading the land again. The storm had altered more than physical structures. It had exposed patterns of drainage, weaknesses in design, and areas where previous assumptions about stability had been incorrect. The ranch, in a sense, was speaking more clearly now, not because it had changed its language, but because the noise that once obscured it had been temporarily removed. The woman noticed this first in the documents they returned to later in the morning. When she reopened the files, the patterns they had been tracing before the storm now aligned differently. What once looked like scattered irregularities now appeared as consistent emissions across time. It was not a single failure point. It was repetition of a particular kind of oversight, one that had been normalized through familiarity. She spoke without looking up. "This was random," she said. The cowboy working nearby responded without stopping. "No," he said. "It was tea." The child, sitting on the edge of a repaired section of fence, listened, but did not add anything. Their silence was not absence of thought. It was selection of when thought required expression. Later, while reviewing one of the older land records again, the woman noticed something she had missed before. A change in notation style across different years suggested not just different record keepers, but different priorities in what was considered worth documenting. Certain events were recorded in detail, while others, equally significant in physical impact, were summarized or omitted entirely. It was not evidence of corruption. It was evidence of shifting attention. She pointed it out to the cowboy. "Look at this," she said. "It's not just missing information. It's selective information. He studied it for a moment. "So the gaps aren't accidents," he said. "Not all of them," she replied. The child, overhearing, spoke from where they were sitting. "Sometimes people only write down what they think will matter later," they said. Neither adult responded immediately. The statement was simple, but it reframed the entire structure of what they were looking at. By midday, the ranch had entered a rhythm that felt different from the days before the storm. There was still work, but it was no longer reactive. It was interpretive. Each task carried awareness that the land had already revealed certain truths under pressure, and now those truths needed to be understood in calmer conditions. At one point, while moving materials near the rebuilt section of fence, the cowboy paused and looked across the land. The woman noticed his stillness. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "I am thinking that nothing here ever breaks all at once," he said. "It just shows where it was already failing." The woman nodded slightly. "That's true of more than land," she said. He did not disagree. The child nearby continued working, without interrupting the exchange, but their presence remained steady, as if grounding the conversation in something practical rather than abstract. As the afternoon light began to shift, they slowed their pace. The immediate repairs were no longer urgent. What remained were smaller adjustments, the kind that matter less for survival and more for stability over time. At some point, the woman returned to the object they had found earlier. She looked at it again, turning it slightly in her hand. It still did not fully reveal its purpose, but it no longer felt random. It felt like part of a longer continuity they had not yet fully mapped. The cowboy noticed. "You think it matters?" he asked. "I think it was kept for a reason," she said. The child, without looking up, added quietly, "Things don't stay in places for no reason out here." No one responded, because there was nothing to correct. By the time evening approached, the ranch had settled into a quieter version of itself. The repairs were not complete, but they were underway in a way that felt sustainable rather than urgent. The documents had been reorganized with greater clarity. The land had been partially restored, partially reinterpreted. They stood together near the center of the property as the light softened. The cowboy spoke first. The storm didn't change. "What this place is," he said. The woman looked across the land. "No," she agreed. "It showed us what we weren't seeing." The child, standing slightly apart, but still within hearing distance, said nothing for a moment. Then, as if concluding something only, "They had been tracking," they said. "Now you can see it better." And in that simple statement, there was no judgment, no conclusion, and no comfort offered beyond observation, only clarity. And clarity, out here, was often the beginning of understanding rather than its end. The 14th day arrived without ceremony, as if the ranch had decided that marking time too loudly would be unnecessary. The repairs from the storm were no longer in their urgent phase, but they were not finished either. They existed in that in-between state where work becomes less about survival and more about responsibility carried forward into ordinary hours. The fence line still leaned in places that reminded everyone of what had happened, and the rebuilt section near the storage structure stood solid but visibly new, as if it had not yet learned how to belong to the land again. Inside the ranch office, the documents had been reduced to a more controlled order, not because everything was resolved, but because the urgency of interpretation had shifted into something quieter. The letter that had once been the sense of everything now rested in a plain folder, no longer treated as an event, but as part of a sequence that had grown far larger than its original mistake. It no longer felt like something that demanded attention every moment. It had become something that had already changed them, whether or not it was ever fully understood. The woman arrived early, as she had begun to do, without noticing the pattern forming. She stood at the table for a moment before sitting, her eyes moving across the remaining documents, not with expectation, but with a kind of measured acceptance that understanding often comes in layers rather than conclusions. She had stopped looking for a single answer. Instead, she was learning to recognize consistency, where once she had only seen fragments. The cowboy came in shortly after, carrying a list of repairs that had been completed and those still pending. He placed it on the table without comment, then leaned slightly against the edge of the doorway for a moment before stepping fully inside. There was a different weight to him now, not physical fatigue, but the awareness that the ranch was no longer just something they were temporarily maintaining. It was something they were beginning to interpret as part of their own decisions. The child was already outside again, as they often were, moving between repaired structures and untouched land with the same steady attention they had shown since the beginning. They did not announce themselves, and they did not need to. Their presence had become part of the rhythm of the place, not separate from it. The morning work began without discussion, as it had gradually become the pattern between them. The woman reviewed final documents required for the estate process, ensuring that nothing remained incomplete in the formal sense. The cowboy inspected structural repairs, confirming that everything critical had held after the storm. These were tasks that could be described in practical terms, but beneath them ran a quieter layer of awareness. The understanding that what they were doing was not just closing a legal chapter, but determining what kind of continuity would remain after the paperwork ended. At one point, while organizing a final set of records, the woman paused. She had reached a page that no longer seemed to belong to the administrative structure they had been following. It was not new, but it felt newly significant in the way that often happens when context shifts. She did not immediately call the others over. Instead, she read it twice before speaking. The cowboy noticed her stillness first. "What is it?" he asked. She slid the page across the table. "It's the final instruction," she said. He looked at it carefully. The language was simple, almost understated, but the meaning behind it was not. It confirmed what they had slowly begun to understand over the previous days, that the condition tied to the ranch was never meant to be interpreted purely as a transaction. It was designed to require presence, not just authority. It required that those involved remain long enough to see what the land revealed under pressure, under time, and under shared responsibility. The child entered shortly after, sensing the shift in the room without needing explanation. They moved to the edge of the table and looked at the document, not asking for it to be read aloud, but reading it in their own way by observing the reactions of the adults rather than the text itself. The cowboy finally spoke. "Today is the 14th day," he said. The woman nodded. "One more until the deadline." The statement hung in the air without tension. It was not a warning. It was simply a fact that now carried weight because of everything that had led up to it. There was still work to be done that day, but it was different in nature. It was not about repair or discovery. It was about completion, not in the sense of ending something, but in the sense of bringing it to a point where it no longer required constant interpretation. By midday, they had moved through most of the remaining tasks. The ranch was not transformed into perfection. It was not resolved into simplicity. Instead, it had reached a kind of functional clarity. Everything that had been broken had either been repaired or acknowledged. Everything that had been hidden had either been found or understood as something that could no longer remain unseen. At one point, the child approached the woman quietly while she was reviewing the final papers. "Are you leaving tomorrow?" they asked. The question was not asked with fear or expectation. It was asked with the same straightforward curiosity the child applied to everything that mattered. The woman paused before answering. "That depends on what happens tomorrow," she said. The child nodded, accepting the answer without resistance. Later, the cowboy and the woman stood outside for a moment while the child moved further down the fence line. "It feels like something is supposed to happen," the woman said. The cowboy looked across the land. "Something already did," he replied. She glanced at him. "You mean the storm?" "No," he said, "before that, when the letter got here." There was a quiet understanding between them then, not of outcome, but of origin. Everything that had followed had not been caused by the letter alone, but by the decision to treat its misdirection as something worth following. As evening approached, they returned inside to finalize the last of the paperwork. The formal process would conclude the next day, but most of what could be prepared had already been done. The remaining step was not administrative. It was presence. That night, none of them left the ranch office early, not because they were waiting for something dramatic, but because there was a shared recognition that the 14th day was not about resolution. It was about allowing everything that had been uncovered to exist without being rushed into conclusion. The child sat near the doorway, occasionally glancing between the adults and the quiet land outside. The cowboy stood near the table, no longer reviewing documents, but simply present. The woman placed the final set of papers into order, then did not immediately close the folder. After a long pause, she spoke. "Tomorrow is the last day," she said. The cowboy nodded once. "Yes." The child looked up briefly. "And then what happens?" Neither adult answered immediately, not because they did not know what the next procedural step was, but because they were beginning to understand that the real answer was no longer located in procedure. The silence that followed was not uncertainty. It was recognition that some things only become visible when they are no longer being prepared for. Outside, the ranch remained unchanged in structure, but no longer uncertain in meaning. The land had already revealed what it would reveal. The letter had already done what it would do, and the people standing inside the quiet space between them were no longer waiting for discovery. They were standing at the edge of completion, where what mattered was not what had been found, but what they had become while finding it. The 15th morning arrived with a stillness that felt less like silence and more like settlement, as if the land itself had finally stopped rearranging the meaning of everything that had happened, and was now simply holding it in place. The ranch looked the same at first glance. The fence lines were where they had always been. The rebuilt structure stood unchanged from the night before, and the office light came on at its usual hour. But for anyone who had lived through the previous 14 days, nothing about the place felt identical anymore. It was not that the land had changed. It was that it could no longer be seen without remembering what it had revealed. Inside the ranch office, the final documents lay neatly arranged on the table, no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty that had followed them for so long. The letter, once the center of confusion and motion, now rested at the top of a completed file. It no longer felt like a mistake that needed correction, nor like a mystery that demanded solving. It felt like the beginning of everything that had forced them to pay attention to what had been ignored for too long. The woman arrived first, standing at the table without sitting immediately. She looked at the papers not as obstacles or tasks, but as records of something that had already been lived through. When the cowboy entered, there was no sense of anticipation in his movement, only continuity, as if the work had naturally carried itself to this point without needing ceremony to validate its completion. The child followed shortly after, quieter than usual, moving directly to the doorway and leaning there as they observed the two adults in silence. No one spoke at first, because there was nothing left to prepare. The decisions had already been made in smaller moments over the previous days, in the storm, in the repairs, in the reading of what had been left unsaid for too long. What remained now was not choice, but acknowledgement. The woman finally broke the silence. "It is done," she said softly, not as conclusion, but as recognition. The cowboy nodded once. "The paperwork is done," he agreed. The child looked between them. "Does that mean the ranch is finished too?" they asked. The question lingered in the room longer than the words themselves, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it required a shift in understanding. The cowboy glanced toward the window, where the land stretched outward without interruption, and then back to the child. "No," he said, "the ranch isn't finished. It's just not waiting anymore." The woman exhaled slowly, as if that distinction had been forming in her mind long before it was spoken. They signed the final papers together, not as a formality of agreement, but as a shared acknowledgement that what had brought them here had been understood in a way that could not be undone. There was no celebration, no sense of victory or loss, only completion in the quietest form it could take. When it was done, the folder was closed and placed aside. They stepped outside together, without discussion. The morning air was clear, not unusually so, but without the tension that had marked earlier days. The land did not feel resolved, but it felt honest in a way that required no further interpretation. The fence line still carried the memory of the storm. The repaired structure still bore the marks of reconstruction. But nothing here felt like it was waiting to be fixed anymore. The child walked slightly ahead, then paused near the edge of the yard where the ground opened toward the pasture. The woman and the cowboy stopped a few steps behind. "So what happens now?" the child asked again, this time not about the paperwork, but about everything that had followed it. The cowboy looked at the land for a long moment before answering. "Now it keeps going," he said. The woman nodded, as if accepting that answer, not as closure, but as reality. The child considered it briefly, then turned back toward them. "Then I guess I stay where it makes sense," they said. There was no correction, no further explanation needed. A quiet passed between them. Not heavy, not uncertain, but full in a way that did not require words to complete it. The woman looked at the cowboy. "We didn't just find a letter," she said. He shook his head slightly. No," he replied. "We found what happens when someone finally decides not to ignore where things end up." The wind moved lightly across the ranch, carrying nothing urgent with it. And for the first time since everything began, nothing about the land felt like it was asking to be understood immediately. It simply remained, and that, in its own way, was enough. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
This story begins with something small enough to be dismissed without a second thought, a letter addressed to the wrong person. In most places, that would be the end of it. A simple correction, a returned envelope, a forgotten mistake. But in the world of the American West, where distance is long, systems are imperfect, and people often live with what never quite reaches them, even a small error can reveal something much larger underneath. When the cowboy chose to read that letter, he was not choosing a grand destiny. He was choosing attention. And that choice quietly set everything in motion. What followed was not just a journey of 40 miles, but a journey into the invisible spaces between people, the places where communication breaks down, where intentions are lost in transit, and where silence slowly becomes normal without anyone noticing. At its core, this story is about responsibility that is not assigned but chosen. The cowboy did not owe the woman anything. There was no legal obligation, no personal connection at the beginning, no expectation that he should care. And yet he did. That simple decision reflects one of the most important moral ideas in human life, that compassion is most meaningful when it is not required. As the story unfolds, the letter becomes more than paper. It becomes a symbol of everything that is easily ignored in modern life: missed messages, delayed truths, and people who stop expecting to be reached. The journey to find the intended recipient is not just about correcting an error. It becomes an act of restoring presence where absence has quietly settled. But the deeper lesson of this story is not about fixing what was broken. It is about noticing what was already breaking long before anyone realized it. The ranch, the land, the documents, and even the relationships between people all carry traces of things that were never properly delivered emotionally, legally, or personally. The storm in the story does not destroy these things. It reveals them. There is also a quieter truth running underneath everything. People are often connected by more than they know, but separated by more than they admit. The cowboy, the woman, and the child are not brought together by coincidence alone. They are brought together by a shared history of things that were never properly acknowledged until someone finally chose to look closely enough. In the end, this is not a story about a letter. It is a story about attention, presence, and the moral weight of not walking away when something feels unresolved. It reminds us that kindness is not always dramatic, and responsibility is not always assigned. Sometimes it appears quietly, disguised as inconvenience, asking only one thing in return: that we do not ignore it. No. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: what we choose to notice can change not only the lives of others, but the direction of our own.